At Smart Trucking, we're all about safety here. Now, one of the best safety tools a truck driver has is the Jake brake, and it is probably the tool that is most misused and misunderstood. I've been in trucks where the Jake brake made a whole lot of noise but had absolutely no stopping power. I've talked to drivers, new and experienced, who thought the Jake brake should only be used on dry pavement. In this video, we're going to talk about the Jake brake and how to use it. You know, it's expensive every time you change carriers. You lose time and you lose money. Why not just start with a carrier that you know is going to be good in the first place? GP Transco, they're centrally located in Illinois. They hire out of all the lower 48 states. They're a great carrier to work for, and I would work there. Check them out at gptransco.com. First, a little bit of history about the Jake brake. The Jake brake was invented by Clessie Cummins, yes, of Cummins engine fame, the guy that invented the Cummins engine, and he invented it out of necessity because he damn near creamed himself coming down the Cajon Pass in Southern California in the 50s and burned his brakes out. And he knew right then and there he had to build something to help, because that was a real problem for him and all sorts of guys. And by 1960, Clessie Cummins had invented what is now today's Jake brake. First, of course, it was only available on Cummins engines. But when everybody else saw how well the thing worked, first Detroit Diesel bought in, then Mack bought in, and then finally even Caterpillar had to admit that it was better than their brake saver, and they all bought in and were all buying Jake brakes to use on their engines. Now, Jake brakes didn't really become common until the late 80s, early 90s, and I remember being in the mountains in the 70s and running into all sorts of guys that didn't have Jake brakes yet, even though they'd been out since the 60s. And they were an expensive thing, and carriers didn't want to buy them, but they were such a safety tool that anyone that had them knew instantly what a great brake-saving device this was, what a super safety device it really was. And eventually, pretty much all the carriers adopted the Jake brake. You don't see too many trucks without one now. So this is how the Jake brake works. What it actually does is open the exhaust valves in the engine just before the engine hits its compression stroke and robs the motor of that compression stroke. Instead, the gases go back into the cylinder and it turns it into a braking system because it slows down, it bogs down the whole engine and slows the whole thing down. Most modern diesel engines today are 6-cylinder engines with 3 heads. 1, 2, 3. These are the heads. Now, each one of these heads contains 2 cylinders. Each one of these heads has a Jake for each of the 2 cylinders. And this is why you get 3 positions on most Jakes, is because most engines have 3 heads. So there's a Jake for this head, a Jake for this head, and a Jake for this head. Position 1, position 2 combines the Jake on 2 of them. Position 3 uses all 3 heads at the same time for the most stopping strength. The Jake brake is not designed to work on glare ice, and this is where guys get into trouble and make their mistakes, because they create themselves a jackknife situation. It works fine on snow, it works fine on wet roads. There are a few things you should keep in mind. The vehicle should be straight when you engage the brake, the engine brake, particularly if it's going downhill on a slippery road. You should be pointing the thing straight so it doesn't tend to wander in the curve. And of course, it depends on how much weight you have on the truck too. You can go down the side of a mountain in the snow with the Jake brake on 3rd and never have to touch the brakes. And that's good control. It's nice when you're doing that. Mind you, you want to keep the engine in the proper RPM range, because if you let the thing over rev and run high, it'll damage the Jake and it'll damage the engine as well, of course. You don't want to run the Jake when the engine is low on oil, because not only will that damage the Jake, it will damage the engine as well. So you should be checking this stuff in your circle check before you leave. And the other thing you shouldn't do is activate the Jake when the engine's still cold. It's just hard on it. You don't want to do that. Let's talk a little about another misconception that a lot of guys have, because they see signs posted on the road and it says no engine brakes. Now, when you see a sign like that on the 215 going around Salt Lake City, You've got people with houses that have built houses on the side of the mountain beside a freeway. And in my opinion, safety trumps a noise bylaw. So I have no problem using the Jake going around the 215 because its principal function is to slow the truck down. Those are steep grades and you need to be able to have that braking power. So to heck with the bylaw. I don't know anyone that's ever gotten a ticket for using the Jake on the 215. Now using it in town is another thing completely. You shouldn't be going quickly enough in town in the first place to have to activate the Jake brake. So there's no need to use it in town, and if you do get a ticket in town for jaking, well, you probably deserve it. Let me say this as well. I've seen guys Jake braking through town, floating the gears, bobtailing, and the Jake will hit every time they shift gears, and they're just bobtailing through town. That's some super trucker or some Billy Big Rigger. That's just stupid. No wonder the public gets annoyed with performances like that. It gives them a bad impression of truck drivers. So, don't set yourself up to look like a fool. Now, Jake brakes should not be confused with brake savers. Brake savers, and they were primarily made by Cat back in the 60s and 70s, were a different device. It worked completely differently. What they did was they had a special oil pump, and the vanes off the crankshaft would spit oil up into like a torque converter system on the bell housing, and it would create a hydraulic lock almost on the driveline to slow the truck down, and it worked pretty well, but not as well as the Jake brake. And you don't see those often today. In older trucks, really old trucks, you'll still see them. Like the Lettuce King still has one in his old Pete, and other than that, you see them on heavy haul applications, but they're not very common these days at all. The brake saver is usually applied there's a second stick by the trailer brake, and usually the driver can just put a little pressure on that stick by the trailer brake on the steering column and increase the pressure to increase the slowing down capacity of the truck. So as we discussed when we were outside looking at the engine, the Jake has 3 positions because it's got 3 heads. So the Jake in the third, or the strongest position, is where I leave mine about 80% of the time. It'll drag the truck right down. Now I've been in trucks where it just made noise, but it really didn't slow the truck. And if you come across that, and I've seen that a fair bit in these new emission-friendly motors, but if you come across that, there's something wrong. The Jake isn't properly set up. You need to take it into the engine dealer and have it set up, because just making noise and not slowing the truck down isn't right. So here we are going downhill, third position on my Jake. And you can hear the engine winding down, even though we're going downhill. There's second position. That's 2 heads working. And there's 1 head. That's the first position. And you can tell it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference at all. Now, as I said, I use the Jake in third spot 80% of the time or better. Here are my Jake control switches. It's off right now. I turn the Jake on. It's in high or third position. I take my foot off the fuel. There it is. Bump it down to second position. Take my foot off the fuel. Still works pretty well. Position 1 doesn't really do a whole lot, but it doesn't need to. And there you can hear the differences as the engine slows. But as I say, I run it in full. You can use the Jake on wet or slippery road. You've just got to be a little more careful. The truck should be pointing dead straight when you throw it on, so you don't tend to jackknife the thing to one side if the wheels start to slip when you throw the Jake on. But I use it on just about everything except glare ice. And on glare ice, you shouldn't be on the road at all. You should take your feet off everything and just coast to the side. You shouldn't be driving on glare ice. When it's really greasy, you may want to try it on just position 1. Generally, I find number two position works just fine for when it's even really slippery. And the rest of the time, I just leave it on the third spot. And I go down snow-covered hills like Parley's and Sherman and that all the time using the third position Jake. A little different if you're empty as compared to loaded. You've just got to be a little more careful, but it's one of the best safety tools ever invented for a truck. I can't think of any invention that's come down the pike for trucks in the last 40 years that I've been driving that has been more useful than the Jake brake. And it's to the point today where I wouldn't drive a truck without one. They're a huge safety advantage. Get familiar with it, and if you're not comfortable with it, practice with it enough until you are, because it's a valuable tool. Stay safe, keep the rubber side down, get familiar with your Jake brake, and I'll see you on the back haul.